you have questions during the session, you can write. So we have a couple decades of fairly extensive health survey, and particularly dark chocolate in the mental health realm. So that's the good side of the story. And more recently, particularly Consumer Reports, 82% of dark chocolate bars they pulled on the market, and they only looked at, so 82% of them had levels by the state of California, which is the state that most is. Am I hurting myself or am I helping myself by eating dark chocolate? And what I would say is the chocolate for America. So the Olmec Society more than 4,000 years ago started of cacao, and the producing of chocolate was here. And right from the trunk of the tree, a year, 30 to 40 pods a year, cacao beans and the pulp ferment for up to a week. And the fermentation process destroys some of the alkaloids that are very toxic and bitter, or at least bitter in the cacao, making it eventually more palatable. After the fermentation process has occurred for up to a week, then the beans are spread out to sunshine to dry out the beans enough. The beans are then cleaned and roasted, and the outer shell of the beans is removed. The cocoa nib is ground up and processor, and there's no alcohol in this. Liquor just means liquid in this case. And chocolate is combined with some amount of cocoa butter and some amount of sugar and other components added. So if it's a milk chocolate, usually some form of cocoa solids. The darker the dark chocolate, the more the higher content of cocoa solids. Effects and the mental health benefits of cocoa. There's a group of chemical substances on the planet. So cocoa does have cocoa solids is about, so theobromine is a different methyl-xanthine. There's also opens up blood vessels. And then the other contains some of the other important health effects, or convey some of the health effects of chocolate. So when we're looking at chocolate, substances in the chocolate, and some of the, what we can see is dark chocolate consumption is correlated in a number of different studies with lower rates of inflammation, lower risk of developing diabetes. In the mental health range, effects are benefits for cognition, so rates of developing mild cognitive impairment, which is a precursor to dark chocolate consumption. There are some, so when, aside from the epidemiologic studies, the other way to conduct studies is to give people either and see if you can measure an effect. And those studies have a time of chocolate consumption, whereas the acute ones are looking at, if you give someone a dose right now, what do you see? I'd say the most consistent findings from what you can see in the chocolate, that it didn't taste good or was so grainy that it wasn't palatable. And the mood boosting effects seem to be more present in the chocolate that had a nice mouthfeel and flavor and taste. And so it's clear that at least some of the mood boosting effects is a happy effect, a hedonistic effect, and not a direct, some chemical component is mood boosting. There isn't a chemical component. So some of the acute studies have not found some effects. And then there's subacute studies performed compared to a group given a controlled, sometimes a placebo, something else, very often the theobromine in it. So one of the more impressive recent studies gave people every day for a month. And at the end of that month, these were young volunteers. What they found was increased theobromine in the brain. Great, you'd expect that. You're giving them theobromine. Increased nerve, inducing at some level nerve, and measurable improvements in attention, working. These are all areas that many people with ADHD have some impairment in, and the expectation would be if this is helpful. Again, that has not been often included in commercial candy bars. Detrimental effect on focus, attention, concentration. But Consumer Reports released a study in December. had either levels of cadmium or lead, or been at least half a dozen lawsuits against the chocolate companies filed since then. But in some ways, this is old news. So there's a organization called As You Behave Better. So it's involved in all sorts of aspects of shareholder or corporation 14, where they studied more than 400 candy bars at a broader range. So they were looking at milk chocolate, white chocolate, and findings from their studies, which are online and they keep updating and repeating. Index were a few things that were notable. One is whether it was a small boutique company or a big mega brand like Hershey's, organic or not, didn't matter. Big company or not, didn't matter. The high right now, the majority of beans for Ivory Coast and Ghana. So there's two, and that's usually considered bulk or common chocolate, the cadmium and eventual breakdown in the environment. Cadmium's always going to be cadmium, lead's always going to be lead. Your body slowly can excrete it, but slowly means over the course of 30, 40 years. There are medical interventions for people with particularly high. So essentially what your liver and bone are places cadmium goes and is toxic to all those. Most of cadmium, so both cadmium and lead, these heavy metals, come from industrial processes. They're used in paint. Cadmium's employed in electrolysis, electroplating, and nickel cadmium battery. It is still present in automotive, particularly small plane. Gasoline still contains to this day lead additives. Lead past century has been stand mold and degrade over a slew of degradation, soldering around joints. The Latin word for lead is considered to be safe, but marked measurement logic problems, hyperactivity, and that some of the crime wave in the 80s was correlated with babies that were born in the early 60s and 70s when lead pollution was high. In early 20 years is the highest rate of crime use, crime committing. So one question, so lots of the articles I've seen recently, cocoa plant itself, cacao plant, area that could contaminate it. It could be in packaging. It could be the additives. It might not be chocolate itself. It could be the sugar or the other things you're adding to it. And As You Sow, part of what their work did is they commissioned an extremely extensive, detailed, both the lead contamination and the cadmium contamination are brought in at the level of cadmium was pretty clearly taken up by the plants. So the cadmium was from metal processes contaminating the ground. Plants take it up and it wasn't contaminating the soil, wasn't contaminating the plant of after fermentation, spreading on the beans at that stage and became a component of As You, and I think it was 2018 where is that As You Sow proposed. And one of the things you can see from the cadmium or lead levels over the years with some of their products. So the highest concentrated sources in our diet are chocolate bodies. These are contaminants this is my Valentine list, so I couldn't find data on 2 of the 5 that I could, actually assumption of 1 ounce chocolate, which sounds like a tiny amount. The general recommendations going chocolate, avoid dark chocolate. If you're a pregnant woman, it's probably a good idea and slowly accumulating. But again, if you're consuming it in moderation, unless you're consuming the highest of the worst of the worst. So 1, check the lists that are there. Again, As You Sow anyone can access the list to see how much chocolate is there. 2, sign the petitions to, probably limit intake of dark chocolate to an. If you don't have a list handy or don't I mean, mitigation approaches that the As You Sow recommended was essentially dose with each fix of chocolate. But before I shut off and give anyone else